Welcome to the Lost Caverns of Ixalan rules video. I'm Nelson.
I'm Serge. We're going to go over the new and returning mechanics. Craft is a new mechanic combined with an old favorite, transforming double-faced cards. Want to make your permanent even better? Pay the cost and craft your card into a shiny new version. Craft abilities are activated abilities with costs that include both a mana component as well as an additional material component. Craft abilities are written craft with material mana. This means pay mana, exile this permanent, exile material from among permanents you control and or cards in your graveyard, return this card to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control, activate only as a sorcery. If the materials required include multiple objects, you can split the cost among permanents both in play and in your graveyard. They don't all have to be from a single zone. You may exile tokens you control as part of the material's cost. However, because tokens cease to exist when exiled, any abilities that refer to what you use to craft the back faces won't refer to anything. As you can see, craft is pretty straightforward. It's essentially a new and flavorful way to use transforming double-faced cards. The rules for transforming double-faced cards haven't changed since their last appearance, but allow me to do a quick recap. Each face of a transforming double-faced card has its own set of characteristics: name, type, subtype, abilities, and so on. In every zone other than the battlefield, consider only the characteristics of its front face. If it is on the battlefield, consider only the characteristics of the face that's up. The other face's characteristics are ignored. A transforming double-faced card enters the battlefield with its front face up by default, unless a spell or ability instructs you to put it onto the battlefield transformed, in which case it enters with its back face up. The mana value of a transforming double-faced card is the mana value of its front face, no matter which face is up.
Ever wish you could dig through your deck to get to that delicious value even faster? With the new Discover mechanic, both you and your opponent will get a surprise. Yours just might be more pleasant than theirs.
Discover N means exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card with mana value N or less. That card is discovered, and you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. If you don't cast it, put it into your hand. Put the remaining exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order.
A spell's mana value is determined only by its mana cost. Ignore any alternative costs, additional costs, cost increases, or reductions. When you discover, you must exile cards. The only optional part of the ability is whether you cast the exiled card or put it into your hand. You exile the cards face up. All players will be able to see them. If you cast a spell without paying its mana cost, you can't choose to cast it for any alternative costs. You can, however, pay additional costs. If the spell has any mandatory additional costs, you must pay those to cast it. If the discovered card has X in its mana cost, you must choose 0 as the value of X. If you can't cast the discovered card, you'll put it into your hand. Some spells and abilities that cause you to discover may require targets. If each target chosen is an illegal target as that spell or ability tries to resolve, it won't resolve and you won't discover.
Have you ever dug too deeply and too greedily? Well, good news! Now you can be rewarded for that behavior. Descend and Fathomless Descent are ability words used to highlight abilities that care about how many permanents are in your graveyard at any given moment, no matter when they were put there. Cards with Descend N have abilities that care if you have at least N permanent cards in your graveyard. Cards with the ability Fathomless Descent have abilities that count how many permanent cards are in your graveyard. Some Descend triggered abilities include intervening if clauses. Each of these abilities checks your graveyard at the moment it would trigger to see if it does. If you don't have the required number of permanent cards in your graveyard at that time, the ability doesn't trigger at all. If it does trigger, it will check again as it tries to resolve. Once again, if you don't have enough permanents at that time, as the ability resolves, none of its effects will happen. Some cards refer to a player who has descended this turn. A player who has descended has had a permanent card put into their graveyard from anywhere this turn. Other cards refer to the number of times a player descended this turn. Those cards care about the number of permanent cards put into that player's graveyard from anywhere. In either case, it doesn't matter if those cards are still in that player's graveyard. Multiple cards have abilities that begin with, at the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn. These cards don't need to have been under your control at the time you descended. Abilities that begin with, at the beginning of your end step, if you descended this turn, will trigger only once during your end step, no matter how many times you descended this turn. Tokens are not cards, and while tokens are put into the graveyard before ceasing to exist, that action doesn't count as a player having descended.
Next up, a couple smaller new mechanics: finality counters and map tokens. Some spells and abilities return permanents from a graveyard to play with a finality counter on them. If a permanent with a finality counter on it would go to a graveyard from the battlefield, exile it instead. Finality counters work on any permanent, not only creatures. Finality counters don't stop permanents from going to zones other than the graveyard from the battlefield. For example, if a permanent with a finality counter on it would be put into its owner's hand from the battlefield, it does so normally. Finality counters aren't keyword counters, and a finality counter doesn't give any abilities to the permanent it's on. If that permanent loses its abilities and then would go to a graveyard, it will still be exiled instead. Whoop whoop, new artifact token alert! Map tokens are a kind of predefined token. Each one is a colorless artifact with the artifact subtype map and the ability 1. Tap, sacrifice this artifact, target creature you control explores. Activate only as a sorcery. That's right, Explore, a mechanic from the first time we went to Ixalan, is also coming back. Let's refresh ourselves on how it works. If an ability instructs a creature to explore, its controller reveals the top card of their library. If it's a land card, they'll put it into their hand. Otherwise, they'll put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, then choose to either leave that card on top of their library or put it into their graveyard. Once an ability that causes a creature to explore begins to resolve, no player may take any other actions until it's done. Notably, opponents can't try to remove the exploring creature after you reveal a non-land card, but before it receives a counter. If a resolving spell or ability instructs a specific creature to explore, but that creature has left the battlefield, the creature still explores. If you reveal a non-land card this way, you won't put a +1/+1 counter on anything, but you may put the revealed card into your graveyard. Effects that trigger whenever a creature explores trigger as appropriate. Some spells or abilities might cause a creature to explore multiple times in a row. If you reveal a non-land card when a creature explores and leave it on top of your library, then the creature explores again immediately afterwards. You'll reveal the same card again.
That's it for the rules and mechanics. Thanks for watching.
If you have any questions during your games, call for a judge. Thanks.